She called me an ugly cow, in French, thinking I couldn't understand, but I did. Those words landed in my ear like a shard of broken china. The syllables were soft, clipped by someone trying very hard not to be overheard. They were spoken between laughs, right behind the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of small talk. On the other side of the kitchen doorway, David was arranging the roast, as if nothing terrible could touch his evening. The woman at his side, the one he introduced as Camille, smiled while she spoke, and her smile was the kind that had convinced my son to move in with her after only 3 weeks. I poured more wine into my glass and handed the bottle to David. I kept smiling. I kept my voice even. I set the dinner plates down as if nothing in my world had shifted. If you're new here, welcome, and if this story resonates, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It helps to know who else has learned the hard way that charm can be a very sharp thing. We'd met her in late spring, almost 6 months before that night. David had been alone for longer than I'd liked after losing Rob, my husband, 5 years earlier. Rob was a careful man with an attention to small certainties. He polished the silver on Sundays, he kept a list of important dates, and he left us a house with more rooms than I had use for. David, bless him, had a way of loving loud and fast, a way that made him generous to a fault. He fell in love the way a child falls into a puddle, not watching where he went, but laughing when he did. When Camille arrived, she had all the trappings people mistake for substance. A soft French lilt that flickered in and out depending on company, a laugh that turned heads in a room, a wardrobe that suggested a life half lived in Paris, even though she claimed she'd only ever been there on postcards. She loved our mahogany table, admired the family china my grandmother had given me, commented on the ring Rob had left me, the one I'd sworn never to sell, the one my mother had pressed into my hand when I married. She noticed everything. That was the first time something had felt off. Charm isn't illegal. Warmth isn't a crime. But there are patterns, and after a while, as a mother who had watched a few bad choices bloom into consequences, I started to notice the space between her sentences. It was small, like the gap between a person's lips when they are about to lie and the truth jumps out the other side. David saw only the warmth. He saw someone who listened to him with the tender focus he'd longed for. He had been divorced for a few years, juggling shifts and shaky carpentry business, and when someone told him his jokes and praised his plans and asked him about his childhood, he melted. I, on the other hand, noticed details that made my breath catch. An email address with a surname that didn't match her social profile, a photograph of a passport page that looked staged, a story about a job in hospitality that never quite aligned with what the manager I called later described. It began as instinct, that thin line of unease that mothers possess in abundance. It became method when the unease refused to leave. The night she called me an ugly cow was 3 weeks after I overheard a different call that would become the fulcrum of everything. That earlier call wasn't vicious. It was practical. Camille, or the woman claiming to be Camille, had stepped into my pantry to answer a phone. I was at the sink, hand on a dish towel, when I heard French spill into the small space between the fridge and the counter. It was fluent, not the clipped tourist French I sometimes hear from people who studied a semester abroad. It sounded like a language that could belong to someone's grandmother. She spoke quickly, the low tone of her voice taut with satisfaction. I couldn't get every word. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But there were pieces I heard clearly, words that translated into prices, dates, and a plan. Green card, she said. Marry, then divorce. There was a name, not David's, but something about an inheritance, about Le Bijou and the ring, and a mention of funds that would free her within months. She laughed. She said a word, the same ugly word from the dinner, about someone being an ugly cow who would be easy to manage. Her tone was clinical, the way a woman might describe the steps in a recipe. I felt a plate slide from my grip. It didn't break. Rob's china is too stubborn for that. But the jolt of porcelain against porcelain rang in my ears. I stood very still. For a few moments I considered confronting her. Tell David now, I thought. Rip off the bandage and let whatever happens happen. But the words didn't leave my mouth. I thought about how he'd react, how he loved fiercely, how he'd reach for her hand, and the needle of his shame or his hope would prick him and make him choose blindness. I thought about what anger could do in that instant. I remembered Rob and the kind of decisions he would have made, quietly, legally, deliberately. I remembered the ring on my finger and the way Rob had whispered, protect what we built. So I did the unthinkable for 15 seconds of my life. I carried on with dinner. That night set the rules. I would not be the one to humiliate my son. I would not, in a moment of maternal fury, send him and his bride out into the world with my voice as the weapon. I would watch. I would listen. I would gather. And if the time came that something needed to be done, it would be done with precision, not pain. I began in the smallest ways. I watched her social feed even as I pretended not to care. I scrolled through her photos late at night when the house was quiet, and the light from my bedside lamp haloed the pages like a bad actor exposing a script. She posted tastefully. She posted travel images, supposedly from months the visa records suggested she hadn't been abroad. Her LinkedIn had a tidy list of hospitality jobs, dates clean enough they could have been cut and pasted into a catalog. Her Facebook friends were mostly other profiles with that same glossy, curated look. I heard about things you'd rather not know about your child, that they were vulnerable, that they were easy to love because they gave love away. I also learned that charm can be rehearsed, and that rehearsed charm is often the first sign of someone performing to collect rewards. Claire, my niece who works at the State Department and Visa Services, was the next person I called. Claire has a pragmatic streak the color of winter mornings. She was blunt and tender in the way she gave me a checklist. Look for rapid relationship timelines, check employment histories, look for patterns of people who leave abruptly, pay attention to financial transactions that don't add up. She told me things in a language I didn't want to know but needed, certain phrases used with specific cadence when someone speaks of marrying for papers, the way names repeated across borders often point to networks, not lone wolves. Her advice wasn't about doing anything illegal. It was about knowing what to look for and where a red flag might become a profile. She told me to document everything, to take screenshots, to save emails, and to be careful who I told. People feel protective, she said. They also feel vindicated at different paces. Keep control of the narrative by keeping the facts. Claire's admonition to keep things quiet was more painful than any secrecy. The mother wants to shout, to gather armfuls of proof, to make the wrongdoer taste their own medicine. It's a peculiar kind of grief to hold information about your child's lover and weigh whether disclosure will save or shatter. I tilted between wanting to run into the living room and shake sense into David, and the realization that public shaming could pull him further into the person I feared he was letting in. So I hired Marcus. I didn't want to, but he came recommended by a woman who owed me a favor and who had once worked with Rob on an estate issue. Marcus Webb was the kind of man whose presence shrank an overgrown problem into a file. He was in his late 40s, had a weathered face that suggested a career of sleepless nights over surveillance footage, and spoke too quickly about evidence and chain of custody for the kind of person who liked romance and soft answers. He was respectful when I asked for him to be discreet. He was practical when I said I didn't want to break my son's hide in public. He asked the right questions and didn't ask that I do anything he'd later regret. We began with the internet. Marcus found a few inconsistencies almost instantly. A photograph of Camille against a Parisian backdrop bore the metadata of a stock image. An email header suggested one of her businesses had been registered with a forwarding service in another state. Marcus found a string of transactions, modest amounts moving across accounts, payments that didn't quite align with her claimed employment, receipts for plane tickets with names that didn't match the passport name she showed us at home. He turned those into a folder. When he added a phone log that matched the dates I had overheard the French conversations, the folder grew a weight I couldn't ignore. He worked methodically. He interviewed former roommates under the guise of canvassing for a lost pet. He took photographs from a distance of the cars she drove and matched them to registration documents. He found references that, when chased, evaporated into dead accounts and unreturned calls. Marcus didn't work like a character on television, the sort who bursts into rooms with cuffed hands and dramatic reveal. He worked like someone assembling a puzzle, where the prize was not a picture, but the answer to a child's future. There were ethics to be considered. For every piece of evidence he gathered, Marcus asked me how I planned to use it. He refused to do anything illegal. He reminded me, gently and repeatedly, that the purpose of an investigation was to inform choices, not to punish at random. The worst thing, he said the first time we met, is acting without a clear goal. You can win a battle and lose a relationship forever if you don't know what you're protecting for. I took notes. I felt my anger lined with shame for the thought that I'd have to play chess with my son's life. During those weeks, I slept less. I made lists of what was at stake. The ring, the house, the small savings Rob had insisted we keep in an account with a name only I recognized. I kept the documents I could access in a safe place. I spoke to my attorney only to learn how to secure certain assets without making obvious that something suspicious had cropped up. The attorney's advice was bureaucratic and dry in the way that bureaucracy often is.
reminding me that there are legal ways to protect property and that institutions move in slow, deliberate cycles. I took their words like a balm and a chain, protection with strings attached. There were nights when I sat at the kitchen table and felt the house like a body. Each room breathed a different memory. Rob's study smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco even years after the last pipe was put away. The guest room where Camille slept sometimes smelled of lavender and something synthetic that reminded me of high-end luggage. I traced the ring on my finger until the cold metal felt like a small shield. I made a rule for myself. I would not speak of the investigation with David, not until evidence was undeniable, not until truth would have teeth. It was a lonely strategy.
I had friends who advised me to tell him now and let him decide. I had other friends who assured me I was doing the right thing, that a mother must sometimes choose the harder path to keep a child safe. The community of those who had loved and lost and then loved again filled the edges of my life with mixed advice. None of them had my exact grief or my exact son. There was no template for this kind of vigilance. 3 weeks after the pantry conversation, another small thing revealed itself. A bank statement arrived in the mail addressed to the name Camille had given, a name that matched her passport, but not the social media footprint Marcus had found. The statement contained a transfer to an account in another state, of an amount modest to most people, but not insignificant. It was the sort of number you might shrug off at first glance, until you realized how few people make a habit of wiring money for rents and flights in the same week they claim they are living paycheck to paycheck. The pattern looked like someone building infrastructure, a series of small moves that, when added together, looked like a map. I sat at the breakfast table and read the line items like a story. I thought of Rob teaching David to balance a ledger, and of how David always insisted numbers were boring until they mattered. I thought of Camille's laugh in the pantry and the way she'd pronounced green card as if it were the destination of a plan already well underway. The emotional calculus for me changed from suspicion to urgency. I wasn't just protecting a ring or a house anymore. I was trying to protect my son from what I suspected would be a slow erosion of his sense of worth. The woman who called me names behind my back, who rehearsed dates and amounts, might be the kind of person who left the men she used with more than financial loss. She might leave them with the steady ache of betrayal that doesn't heal. Marcus presented his dossier one gray afternoon in November. It was a binder thick with printouts, emails, screenshots, copies of the landlord's notes, photos taken with care. He had redacted the names of bystanders and annotated the places where his curiosity had led to dead ends. He did not make a grand declaration. He laid the facts on my kitchen table like bread on a loaf board and let them speak. There was the passport photo, suspicious because the image appeared in other online profiles claiming slightly different names. There were bank transfers. There were references that, when called, said they'd never worked with her. There was a pattern of moving quickly between relationships when someone else had money or a more stable life. There were writings in French, some of which had been posted online and then deleted. There were the dates that matched my own notes, the pantry call, the laughing insult, the plans for marriage and an exit before a green card could be fully secured. Marcus had even found a small, shadowy blog where someone had once chronicled how to get a second passport in a tone that read like a manual. Marcus did not use the word fraud when he showed me those pages. He used indicator. He was careful because words matter in a court of law in ways they don't in a kitchen. He wanted certainty, and certainty is rare until proven. I asked him what we could do. He looked at me as if he were measuring the length of the table between us and deciding which part to walk to. You have a few options, he said. You can confront outright, which may push him away. You can document and escalate in private, which is slower but preserves your leverage. You can try to secure assets quietly, or you can bring this to an agency if the evidence supports it. I heard the options like a list of doors, each open to a different room. None of them was the room where David stood with his arms open, ready to step through. The weeks that followed were a meditation on patience. I secured certain account signatures, updated beneficiaries where necessary, and had Rob safe appraised and changed to a code only I remembered. I felt like a conductor arranging musicians on a stage. The music hadn't started, but when it did, I'd want the instruments in the right place. There was guilt, too. I felt the weight of a mother who had kept secrets from her son in the name of love. Sometimes I imagined him discovering the dossier on his own.
the email printouts tucked into a drawer or the photographs in a box underneath a table, and the way his face might crumple. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to be betrayed by someone you loved and to have your own mother be the one to reveal it. The emotional equation didn't simplify when factors of love and protection and embarrassment multiplied. If anything, the math grew messier. In all that time, Camille never left my sight for long. She was careful. Charm, I realized, can be a shield as much as a weapon. She brought flowers to my kitchen and praised my scones. She made a point of learning how I took my tea. When David and I would argue, and we argued less than I thought we might because he was so convinced of her goodness, she would stand near him and look at me as if all I was doing was testing the limits of his love. She had an answer for everything. It was unsettling how practiced she was at having answers. One afternoon, Marcus called with a new detail. The woman we had known as Camille had a different legal name in a public record he found in another state. The photograph matched, but the name didn't. There were 13 other instances where the name didn't match, but the face did. Marcus said the word alias. He explained, delicately, the ways in which people create patches of identity to stitch themselves into lives. It sounded, when he said it, like someone describing a tailor's work. It shouldn't have made my stomach flip, but it did.
I felt foolish for not noticing sooner. I felt foolish for buying into the romance of a woman who knew how to compliment my china. I felt foolish for letting nostalgia and loss make me kinder to my son when a sterner hand might have saved him from heartbreak. Those are the private confessions that catch in the throat of a mother, the things you only allow to exist when your child isn't looking. And yet there was something else too, a stubborn piece of me that refused to be the parent who watched and then laughed. There is a line between watching and weaponizing, and I didn't want to be on the wrong side of it. So I kept the line in sight and made careful choices. I told myself I was doing this for David's best interests, but sometimes the truth is that the heart makes laws for itself. Then came the night we were all invited to dinner at the Thompsons' house for an early Christmas gathering. David wanted it to be special. He'd been particularly buoyant for days, quoting recipes and checking his watch like someone embarrassed by joy. He told me he was planning to ask her to marry him that night. He didn't tell me he had a ring. He didn't tell me he had borrowed a neighbor's suit. He told me that he wanted my blessing. How could a mother refuse when her son asked for her blessing and placed his trust in a future she had imagined with him? I laid the table as if the house could fool us into peace. I used the good napkins and the crystal wine glasses Rob had given us on anniversaries. I set a place for a future I wasn't sure I wanted to interrupt. We laughed over starter courses. We traded stories that had been part of our family script for years, the ones that smoothed the edges of life. Camille laughed with us. Everything looked, on the surface, as a perfect domestic picture. The insult in French came after roast and before dessert, a half-turned whisper from the small corridor that connects my kitchen to the narrow side pantry. She stepped in to take a call, and words slipped out the way they always do when people are certain their private jokes are safe. I heard the phrase as if it had been picked up by a small radio. Moche vache, she said. Ugly cow. It was deliberate. I heard the syllables exact, not sloppy. I heard the translation in my head even as I arranged the last plate. My hands didn't shake this time. They moved with a slow, theatrical calm. I allowed the words to sit between us like a second dinner guest. That moment, those two X-rated syllables, that tiny sound of a woman who thought the world owed her everything, became the hinge of my life. It wasn't just the insult. It was what followed the insult that knotted my stomach. She spoke in French about towns and amounts and a timetable. She said in the same breath where she laughed about my face, "We will wait until the papers go through. Then we leave. He'll be too proud to notice until it's too late." It wasn't an accident that she used my face as an image. She used it as a threshold, something she could step over and leave behind. I smiled and continued. I cleared plates, I filled glasses, I said small things about cranberry sauce and the weather. When she rejoined the table, her voice was the same musical thing I'd heard for months. She spoke of pastries and of a cousin who lived in Lyon. She touched David's hand as if those fingers were the only evidence she needed to keep faith. I remember thinking, with a clarity that sometimes feels like a vision, that there are people who practice faith and there are people who practice convenience. That night, seated at my own table, I could see that the person across from my son practiced convenience as an art form. After we had exchanged pleasantries and the laugh lines had faded into polite conversation, I did something small and deliberate. I excused myself and went to the pantry where the call had been made. The light was dim. The crumbs of a half-eaten cookie still sat on the shelf.
I ran my fingers along a jar top until my track reached a telephone keypad that felt like a breadcrumb trail. I took out my phone and opened the Notes app as if I were a woman about to write a list. I felt my pulse, stubborn in its old ways, and I wrote the words down, not to confront, not yet, to anchor them so that they could not float away like smoke. That night, I lay awake in the guest room while the house exhaled. I could hear David and Camille whispering through the thin walls, voices meeting in the middle like lovers on a bridge. I did not go to them. I watched the ceiling like you watch an old film. The shadows moved the way they always do in the house Rob and I had built together, and the ring on my finger felt heavy, like a compass. In the morning, Marcus called with a lead. He had, in the quiet hours of his own life, turned over a stone and found something that made his voice go narrow. There was a social profile using a name that matched the passport she displayed in our home, but the profile's friends lived in Marseille and posted photos of the person in a context that didn't fit with Camille's story. Marcus had found an old account that mentioned a real woman named Camille Dubois, a florist in Marseille, and he had the sense, from the images and the few cross-referenced neighbors, that the face being used in our home had once belonged to someone else. When he said the name aloud, the name that would come to mean an entire person outside our drama, I felt a strange pull, like tugging on a thread and feeling an entire sweater begin to unravel. The idea that someone could take another's face, stitch it into a story, and send it across the ocean to become a passport photo in our home made the world feel less stable. It wasn't just theft of money, it was theft of self.
That week, between phone calls and copying bank statements, I drove to Marcus's office and we talked at length about consequences. We didn't plan anything. We marked the places where we might step. Marcus suggested contacting a lawyer to make sure any action taken would be precise and not reckless. I wanted to do things exactly in the way Rob taught me to, with inventories and lists. I also kept thinking about the image of the woman in the pantry, a small flicker of contempt in her eyes. There were evenings when I mouthed apologies to my son in the dark. "Forgive me," I would whisper. "I am doing this because I love you." But I am not sure he ever heard those apologies. Love can be a messy litany when performed in secret. The timeline of everything began to sharpen. The first meeting had been 6 months earlier. She had entered on a tourist visa 8 months before. That was what an embassy clerk told Claire when she reached out quietly to see if anything in their system raised flags. The pantry call had been 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had compiled a dossier by the first week of December. In late November, after the bank statement and the mismatched names, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a chessboard. I thought then of dramatic endings, the confrontation in the living room, the tearful confession, the apology that would make everything soft again. I allowed myself to imagine David forgiving me for the secrecy once he saw the proof and saw the scale of what might have been. But imagination is a dangerous comfort. Real life rarely conforms to tidy acts of contrition. Instead of the tearful confession I had rehearsed in 100 sleepless nights, I began to make a different plan. It was not my plan alone. Marcus and Claire and my lawyer all had roles, each one offering a restraint to my more vengeful impulses. The idea was to gather beyond a doubt, to ensure that if an enforcement agency needed to step in, there would be less ambiguity. The goal, as Marcus kept saying, was to prevent a disaster, not to orchestrate a spectacle. The holiday season compressed everything into faster pulses. There was the tree to be decorated, a small one by Rob's preference, and the dinner invites and the light on the porch that always made the house look kinder. David's proposal night approached like a bright comet. He told me he had planned to wait until the new year, but the timing had seized him and he could not keep from telling me. He asked for my blessing once more, the way you ask for a parent's permission to cross a street. I gave it. I could not do otherwise. Yet underneath that blessing was a plan I had buried like a seed. I would not deny him his moment. I would not be the one to take his happiness with a heavy hand. But I would not remain idle if my suspicions were right. There is a line between protecting and controlling. I tried to keep my feet on the morally correct side of that line. I failed at times. I was human.
The weeks leading to Christmas were a peculiar mix of normalcy and the thin red thread of surveillance. I could set the table with the same care as any grandmother. I could laugh at an aside and cry at a Christmas movie like everyone else. But underneath it all was a file folder I kept locked in my bedroom, and a man named Marcus who called with updates that made my stomach hollow and my hands steady in equal measure. On a rain-swept evening in mid-December, Marcus handed me something I had imagined in my head but didn't believe would exist. A written confession, not in explicit words, but in the way the evidence lined up like dominoes. There were wire transfers, names that matched across different documents, and a passport image whose metadata pointed to dates that did not align with the story she'd given us. Marcus's voice was gentle when he said, "You asked for a case. I'm giving you a file." I looked down at the papers and saw the face I'd invited into my house featured across the top of a ledger. It felt both small and monstrous. Small because it was, after all, paper. Monstrous because paper can change a life. I realized then that there was another person I had not considered, the woman who might truly be Camille Dubois. If a face could be borrowed, a life could be stolen. If identity could be borrowed like a coat in winter, then the person whose name the coat bore would be left naked. The more I learned, the less the world had neat categories. There was the woman in my house, who might be an imposter. There was a real woman in Marseille who might be suffering for the theft of her name. And there was my son, suspended between the two of them, likely without a net. I choose now, looking back, to call her the woman in my house for much of that winter. Names have power, and I wanted to use mine only when I had earned the right to speak them out loud. The dossier grew into a plan: gather more evidence, protect assets quietly, and, if the pieces fit well enough, bring the situation into the light in a way that minimized spectacle and maximized truth. Marcus had his own contacts, Claire had her quiet channels, and my lawyer had a file of what to call when the time came. Still, there was an ache in my chest at what this would do to David. He was the kind of man who trusted easily and who would rather forgive and move on than pick through the ash heap of his mistakes. I saw that in him when he called me the night he told me he planned to propose. His voice was softer and tinier with hope than I had ever heard. It made my decisions feel heavier. I spent December doing both the ordinary and the extraordinary. I bought garlands, I mailed cards, I called an electrician to fix a light, and I met with Marcus in a diner and spoke in low tones about the architecture of lies. I felt like someone living two lives in a house built for one.
The act of speaking to other adults in hushed voices, plotting a possible intervention, was simultaneously empowering and humiliating. I kept imagining David's face the moment he learned the truth, the way an honest person recoils when the foundation of a trust is removed. Then, as if autumn had been saving its final gusts for our story, another detail arrived. Marcus found a small ledger in a hidden account that showed payments to an address in Houston, and when he traced the invoices, he found a pattern that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had used a borrowed face to rent a flat and then move on. The pattern suggested a kind of efficiency I recognized from watching others, the way thieves can be as boringly systematic as accountants. It was not theater, it was work. There were moments of quiet triumph, too. Once, on a clear Tuesday, I found an old postcard in a box of letters from Rob. He had written to me the year we honeymooned in France about a street vendor selling flowers under a sign that read Camille. He had drawn a small heart next to the name. It felt oddly prophetic, a small anchor to a real person whose life was now tangled in ours. As the days shortened toward Christmas, my patience narrowed into a plan. I did not plot revenge. The word revenge felt vulgar in the mouth of a woman who wanted, above all, to keep her son. My plan was to prevent harm and to find the person whose life might have been erased by someone else's urgent hunger for another's identity. I thought of the dinner table like a stage and of the night as a play where everyone had chosen their costumes. I wanted to keep our costumes intact for as long as possible, while also making sure the actor who had borrowed a mask could not simply step off stage and disappear. When the invitation to propose at home arrived like a comet, bright and irrepressible, I realized the stage was set. I set the table like a stage. I polished the silver. I lit the candles. The stakes felt small and planetary all at once. The week before Christmas, I called my sister and told her in nouns and fragments. She cried on the phone and then said the word no one wants to say. You did the right thing. She meant it with her throat, not her head. Family is a place where moral clarity can bend under love. Perhaps that's why we love each other, despite the strange maps we draw to protect one another. On a gray afternoon, while snow threatened the edges of town, Marcus and I sat with the folder. We taped an index card to the top, and on it wrote a single sentence that felt like a vow.
Protect David, preserve truth. It was simple and ugly and perfect. We wouldn't act on impulse. If something had to be done, it would be done with evidence and restraint. The suspense built like a tide. I went to bed imagining ways this could end well. Truth prompting apologies, apologies prompting mending, mending leading to a different and honest future.
I allowed myself such fantasies, even as I prepared for other possibilities. When Christmas Eve approached, the house smelled of orange peel and rosemary, and the lights on my porch threw a warm, forgiving glow over the steps. I cleaned the silver again. I ironed napkins. I rehearsed small lines in my head that had nothing to do with the thing I knew was coming, and everything to do with being a mother who wanted to be present for her son. And yet, in that quiet, the image of that insult, the soft French words that called me names, refused to leave. It had lodged in me like a splinter. I could remove splinters in quiet ways. I could go to a doctor, have it excised, and heal. Or I could let it fester until it infected something larger than the wound. So I made a choice that felt like walking toward a door whose hinges had been greased by fate. I set plates, I lit candles, I prepared a table where a celebration would be held. I told myself I could still give David a moment and still keep him safe. I told myself many things. In the end, that night was a study in paradox, a house full of cheer and an undercurrent of evidence gathering. I felt like a seamstress, stitching a small patch into a larger fabric without the family noticing the new thread. I wanted to keep the laughter. I wanted the photograph of us together to be real. When our guests arrived and the drinks were poured and the chatter swelled like good wind, I held the folder in my bedside drawer and breathed. I listened to the cadence of my son's laughter and the soft music of conversation. I kept my hands busy, a plate here, a joke there, and I learned then the difference between keeping secrets and keeping promises. They are not the same. The doorbell rang twice that evening. The house, for all its history, felt newer than I'd remembered. I thought briefly and with a pain I couldn't name about the life Rob and I had built and how it had been meant to sustain love, not to become a battleground. And still, as the roast was carved and the candles burned steady, part of me was poised for the moment when the evidence we had gathered would become more than paper. I was, like any mother, terrified of what truth might do to my son, and also sure that some truths are necessary, even when they break things. Just before dessert, Camille excused herself. I watched her go, the hem of her coat whispering against the hallway runner. Her smile was easy. She stepped into the little corridor and her phone sang. The words she used then, soft and precise, were the ones that would in time reshape everything. I did not move. I slid one hand along the sideboard and felt the cool of the silver and the warmth of the candle in the same breath. For a moment I allowed the house to be as it had always been, a place of meals and light and the ordinary miracles of family. Then I remembered the pantry, the phone, the laughter that became a plan.
I tucked that memory under my ribs like a small, hard stone and let it sit there while I finished the dessert course and smiled when David raised his glass to say something about the future. The rest of that night becomes a sequence of images that still flash in my mind. The clink of toast, the way the light fell on the crystal, the way David's jaw tightened when Camille returned to the table. I can feel, still, how love can be both blinding and clarifying. I told myself, between the laughter and the fork at my lips, that I was ready for whatever would come next. It was in that place, between a mother's patience and a mother's fear, that the next phase of our lives began to stir. The front door slammed so hard that for a heartbeat I thought it must have knocked the tree lights loose. David left faster than anyone could reach for him. He didn't run out the front. He bolted past the car, out into the yard, and the December air swallowed his silhouette like a page torn from a book. I remember the sound of his boots on the stone path, too familiar, too young, and something inside me folded. It happened before I could stand. The room had already hummed with the polite shock of an interruption. A woman cleared her throat, and in that polite way strangers have at the best and worst of times, said, "Is everything all right?" Agent Sarah Chan, uniformed and careful as if she were stepping into a church during a funeral, answered with an evenness that felt manufactured to cushion what was coming. She asked the woman at our table for her name. The woman, Christina, as the records would later show, had been calm all evening, but as the agent spoke, she let a different voice come out.
The practiced accent fell away like a mask laid on a chair. "I am Camille Dubois," she said, and then with the quickness of someone who has rehearsed for showtime, she switched to plain English and smiled with all the politeness of a person accustomed to crowds. "Is this really necessary? This is an outrage." Agent Chen didn't look at me. She looked at the private investigator holding the binder, Marcus, then back at Christina. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for alleged marriage fraud and identity theft." The words landed in the room like winter rain, clean, cold, and undeniable. There was no TV show handcuff flesh. One of the local officers, there to cover a civil dispute if it turned ugly, stepped forward and gently took her wrist. Christina's shoulders straightened like a woman pulling a coat over herself. For a moment, she looked not like a criminal, but like an actress who'd just been moved from the rehearsals to curtain call. She laughed, a small sound that barely covered terror. "You can't," she began. Then she said something I hadn't heard before. The French slipped back into the syllables of someone who'd forgotten it needed to be hidden. "Mon Dieu," she mouthed. "My God." Then in English, "This will be a very bad mistake for some people."
David's face, when he finally turned, was the color of thin ice. He stared at her, then at the men in uniforms, then at me. For a moment, time condensed into the space between his hands, which trembled as they found his pockets. He turned his head away from the handcuffs and looked at the folder on my bedside table, as if it were the blade that had just been pressed into his chest. "Mom," he said, and he did not raise his voice. It was the quiet that does the most damage. "Why?" I wanted to explain. I wanted to say, gently, that I loved him, that I had tried to protect him, that everything I'd done had been to save him from a slow, invisible theft. Instead, the only thing I managed to do was stand up. My chair scraped, the sound of a very small human thing in the middle of a larger chaos. I watched Christina being led away. She lifted her chin, and for the first time that night, without the accent that had been her armor, spat an American bluntness toward my face. "You think you save him? You destroy him," she said. The words were mean and precise, and they stuck to my ribs. David shoved past me without touch, his breath a storm. He slammed the car door so hard that the house felt the vibration. He drove away in a blur. I knew the route he would take because he'd raced down it many times in different moods, giddy, furious, numb. That night, he used it as an escape. After everyone left, after the agents had taken statements, and the neighbors had been gently shepherded back inside their lives, I sat at the kitchen table with Marcus and Agent Chen and a lawyer who had come quietly on my call. The folder on the table might as well have been a human being. Marcus laid the evidence down like a doctor revealing the diagnosis. There were transfers, emails, and copies of messages. There were passport images whose metadata refused to lie. Agent Chen explained in the most clinical tone she had that an arrest had been made based on the evidence, and that the matter would now pass to her team's follow-up investigators. She told me nothing about what would happen to Christina beyond the immediate custody and the processing that would occur. She could not, and she did not. "Why didn't you tell me?" was the question David left behind in the house, thick in the air. It sat on the mantelpiece like a wreath that would not fall even in time. My answer, if I had the fluency for it, would have been 3 parts apology and 1 part confession, that I didn't trust myself to choose an immediate confrontation. I wanted to be precise. I wanted to be correct. I wanted to be a mother who preserved rather than shattered. What I had been, in part, was fearful of the way his love might blind him. The night after the arrest, I tried to sleep but failed. The house felt both too full and too empty. Rob's study smelled like Caesar. The Christmas tree lights blinked with the patient faith of people who believe in small miracles. Marcus came in once more, sat at the foot of the stairs, and we talked about what would follow. We did not gossip about what would happen to Christina. We discussed the other matter, the real Camille. "There's someone else," Marcus said quietly. "A woman in Marseille named Camille Dubois. She runs a small flower shop. We found her by following the digital breadcrumb the imposter left. Someone used her name and photos in a profile years ago." I had known, abstractly, there might be a life stolen to make this one appear authentic. But when Marcus described the real woman, a small, sharp-eyed florist whose life had been mapped in online listings and neighborhood posts, it was like watching a portrait being revealed. Marcus told me that identity theft had real consequences. Bank accounts flagged, French administrative agencies contacting her about irregularities, and even, in one instance, a local official asking her questions about transactions she had no memory of.
The woman in Marseille had caught wind of the theft only when checks began arriving in her name and people called her shop asking for details she did not know. She has been affected, Marcus said. We can help her. The question is whether she wants to come here, whether she will accept help, and whether David wants to meet the woman whose name was used. There was a softness in Marcus's voice I hadn't heard before. It wasn't pity. It was recognition that there are collateral victims in cons like these, people who have their lives rerouted by a stranger who borrowed their name. Claire worked behind the scenes with the State Department liaison in Houston and with the consulate in Marseille. It took delicate calls, assurances, and the kind of paperwork that makes ordinary people swear. Claire sent me an email, short, professional, and oddly warm, explaining that the real Camille had been located and that she had been contacted. The email said that Camille had confirmed she had experienced disruptions tied to identity theft and that she would accept a plane ticket to fly to Austin to see what had happened and to help with any necessary statements to French authorities. She would arrive with a cousin. The message felt in its plainness like a benediction. When Camille arrived at the airport in Austin, she stepped out of the terminal looking like a woman who'd been plucked from another kind of life and put into ours. She wore comfortable shoes and a coat that had seen too many winters. Up close, her French was precise, lyrical, not performative, and she kept touching a small card between her fingers the way someone might smooth the edge of a photograph with reverent care. We met in arrivals. I had arranged for a chair that gave me the height of a woman used to standing among flowers. She hugged me, surprising me with her warmth, and then we both sat as if under attentive calm. She spoke about her shop in Marseille in a way that made the roses sound like people.
As she told me about the market there, about the morning light in her city, I thought of the photograph Marcus had shown me, a face used by someone else as a passport image, and then thought of the woman now describing the scent of jasmine in her neighborhood, with a laugh that made her cheeks rise. I don't know why someone would use my name, she said in accented English. I have small life. My neighbor knows my business, my customers know me. If something used my identity, I was not aware until letters came from a bank. There was a quiet dignity in her voice, and when she said, "It is confusing and exhausting," I heard not a victim shriek, but an honest exhaustion from dealing with the bureaucracy that can pile onto a life already in motion. We spent days in a strange double intimacy. She told me about her father teaching her how to tie a bow around a bouquet. She showed me images of her shop and spoke of how a wedding season could lift a town and how a winter could make things quiet. I told her how strange it felt to hold a folder whose pages could reshape my son's future. She touched my hand and said, "You did what you had to do." I almost laughed at that, at the simplicity of the phrase. But then I realized she meant it with the practical kindness of someone who understands the weight of being forced into another person's life. David did not speak with his mother for a week. He changed his phone number for a few days, an impulsive thing, and then changed it back. Messages arrived, unread, like small boats in an indifferent sea. He sent one short text that said simply, "Don't come to my shop." We had our arguments, shouted, impossibly painful, in the first days after his leaving. He accused me of humiliation, of orchestrating a spectacle to prove my point. He said things that hurt, precise like knives. I told him, clumsily, about the pantry, about the calls, about the ledger. He listened, but what he heard was not a defense, but a betrayal. "You made a theater of my love," he said, and the phrase turned into a stone that I carried for months. We did not speak much at all. When we did, there was a thinness to our words, as if we were two people trying to resume a conversation where the grammar had been lost. It was among those fractured days that I felt the pull of repair. I did not imagine that I could mend what had been broken simply by asking forgiveness. The rupture was deeper than a single apology. But there are actions that make apologies real. If I could not undo the public humiliation he felt, perhaps I could offer him another thing, the truth, unadorned, and the chance to meet the woman whose stolen identity had been the scaffold for the lies. Marcus and I arranged for the real Camille to meet David in a neutral place, an artfully choice of environment where the air might be soft enough to hold awkwardness. She was willing to meet him. When they sat across from each other in a small coffee shop downtown, I watched with a mother's fierce, tumbling hope. David's hands were wrapped around a mug. He looked at Camille with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, a man trying to read the grammar of someone else's life. Camille spoke quietly and simply about her confusion when letters to her name arrived at her shop in Marseille. She described a phone call from someone in Houston asking for money. She showed him photos of her small team, her cat dozing in flower bins, and a table of blooms she had arranged for a wedding last summer. The mundane intimacy of these details, the kind of things that make up a life, began to soften the hard edges in David's face. "I'm sorry," he said, with the bluntness of someone who had learned to say 2 words when the rest felt clumsy and insufficient. He looked at me then, and for the first time since that night, his eyes were not burning with blame. They were just tired and real. "I was stupid," he told the real Camille. "I'm sorry that your name was used like that." Over weeks, David met with Camille more. He wrote long, halting emails about the way he had been taken, about the embarrassment that had hollowed him. He asked her questions that anyone would ask. How did this start? What was your life like? In turn, Camille asked about his carpentry projects, about the way the light got through the slats on his workbench. They began, as awkward people often do, by talking about small things, the patterns of a city, the best way to tie a bow. Little by little, their conversation spooled into longer threads. There was no rush. There could not be. Some months later, David asked to go to Marseille. He said he needed to see where the name had come from, to understand the woman whose identity had been borrowed, and to meet her people, to witness that the person named Camille was not the woman who had come to Austin under that stolen face. I could have insisted he stay, fearing for his safety or for the turbulence of transatlantic romance. But what would that have been but another attempt at control? He had to walk his own path, and I had to let him. He left in late spring, carrying nothing but a camera and a small notebook. He sent photos of Marseille that made me ache in a way I have not ached since Rob's last days. Sunlight on stone, a market bursting with color, Camille in an apron arranging stems. Her life was ordinary and stubborn in the best of ways. They walked the neighborhoods, met neighbors, and sat in tiny cafes where everyone seemed to know the pace of their town. David sent me one picture of the 2 of them on a small bridge, smiling, careful but present. The prognosis on love is never simple, but there was a truth in those images that lived in the bones in a way the winter before had not. Back in Austin, I focused on other repairs. I worked alongside the real Camille to help her sort the shadow trails the imposter had left.
There were calls to French banks and explanations to be given. Claire offered an envelope of quiet help that made the difference more often than it should. Marcus took care to hand over all the evidence he'd gathered to Agent Chen's team. He provided statements and the careful chronology that prosecutors and consulates prefer when they decide to act. I wrote to people in plain language, asking for patience and telling the truth without melodrama. There were small touchstones of redemption that felt almost indecent in their sweetness. Once, the real Camille and I spent an afternoon in my kitchen making lemon tarts. She hummed in French while our hands floured the counter. She confessed that she had always wanted, as a child, to visit the United States once to see the way people lived in stories. She spoke with such gentle wonder about the world that I realized truth can be quietly beautiful, so much so that it hurts. David returned from France 3 months later, a changed man. He was not healed, that was too simple a word, but he carried an easier way of being. He had spent time learning the local rhythms of Marseille. He had met Camille's friends. He had watched her work. He had returned with news that was not all about romance. He spoke about the real Camille as someone with a life that was not designed to be rescued, but to be shared. They had decided, in a way that felt both rushed and inevitable, to keep seeing each other. He told me, carefully, that he had proposed to the real Camille in the small garden behind her shop. They had planted 2 small roses together, as if to mark a beginning that would be rooted in soil and truth. Months later, when they were married in Provence, an intimate affair with an outdoor reception in a village that smelled like sun and lavender, I sat under a canopy of olive trees with other guests whose lives had been brushed by this strange, messy story. It was a small wedding in a place that felt like a private prayer. The real Camille wore an effortless dress, and David's face had finally found the patient lines of someone who had emerged from a storm. I did not stand beside him that day. It would have been easy to be both mother and guest, but the story had taught me a lesson about presence. Sometimes the most loving thing is to hold your place and let your child step into the life he chooses. I watched from the periphery, my hands folded like an offering. I cried, not because the past had been erased, but because something honest had been born from the wreckage. Love, when true, looks cleaner and truer than any rehearsed performance. There are people who like tidy endings. I'm not one of them. The aftermath of what we'd endured did not disappear like confetti. David and I had a long season of rebuilding trust. There were nights of awkward silence and afternoons when we cooked together and practiced the simpler acts of family.
We both had to be brave in different ways. he in learning to let someone else into his life with a wisdom he had not yet earned, me in learning to let go of a need to protect by controlling. The shame I carried, the guilt for the methods I used, did not evaporate overnight. I apologized more times than I planned. I told him, with the gullibility of a woman hoping for absolution, that I had acted out of a fear so big it had dictated my choices. "Would you do it again?" he asked one evening when we were making coffee, only the sound of the kettle between us. I looked at the ring on my finger and thought of Rob's steady hands. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I hope not. I hope the world gives us fewer reasons to make impossible choices. But if faced with the same evidence and the same fear, I might make the same decision. I am sorry for how I did it. I am also sorry that the choice even had to be made." "You're my mother," he said, a line both soft and final. "You're allowed to be both brave and wrong." Those words were a small gift. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a series of small decisions to trust again. Over time, David and I rebuilt something that looked like the old map but had new landmarks. We had honest Sundays and quiet dinners without cameras or dossiers. We occasionally talked about the things we'd lost, the easy assumption that love makes us invincible, and about what we had gained, a hard-earned honesty and an awareness that people can be both damaged and generous. There remain, even now, things I think about and cannot unthink. Christina, whose real name, Marcus's digging revealed, was Christina Marsh, was arrested that winter. She was processed and moved through detention for the purposes of investigation. I don't tell this as a triumph. The sight of any human in a uniformed holding is never a festive image. The arrest was an event that brought relief and a new kind of sorrow. Identity theft has victims whose pain continues long after an arrest. The real Camille had to reclaim her identity in bureaucratic ways that were exhausting. There are legal processes I will not pretend to understand fully, nor will I speak for their outcomes. I only know the shape of the harm and the labor my neighbors and I undertook to try to mend it. What I learned through all this is layered and not easily put into one tidy pronouncement. Protection, it turns out, is not always purity. Love does not make one right. I had imagined in the quiet of nights that my actions would be praised, or at least understood. They haven't all been either. Some people told me I had been right to act. Some said I should have trusted my son. Both responses felt in their way reasonable. What I want to be clear about is this. I did what I did because I loved a son who had one chance to have a future without the slow theft of his dignity. There were costs beyond the public humiliation that made the neighborhood whisper.
There was the bruise of my son's anger, the way he kept his distance for a while, the way my own hands shook when I tried to be both mother and investigator. There were nights I replayed my decisions and wondered if a different choice would have spared him. I carry those questions like stones in my pocket, handy anchors reminding me that moral clarity is often messy, and that courage and cruelty live side by side in ordinary people. And yet, when the world does tilt toward something true, it is astonishing how quickly small things can stitch a life back together. The real Camille did more than accept help. She taught me a gentler way to be courageous. David found a kind of peace that had nothing to do with theatrical justice and everything to do with living steadily. They married, not because a story demanded it, but because two lives, grown in separate soils, had found an honest way to grow together. I keep Rob's ring on my finger. It is heavy with memory and with a practical history of a man who taught me to be careful with calendars and numbers and with the people we let across the threshold. I learned to be careful in different ways too, to balance the instinct to protect with the humility to ask whether my protection trampled someone's autonomy. I learned that institutional responses, agents, lawyers, investigators, must be used with grave caution and respect for all involved. Marcus taught me the quiet dignity of work done not for spectacle, but for the fidelity of facts. Claire taught me that systems can be helpful if used responsibly. Agent Chen taught me that enforcement need not be cruel to be effective. If there is a final image I keep returning to, it is of the two Camilles in my kitchen. One portrait stolen, one woman who had arranged bouquets for a living, one whose name was taken like a coat off a peg. The real Camille made lemon tarts with a patience that felt like a prayer. She laughed at tiny jokes
and taught me the best way to cut a lemon without splurting juice in your eye. There is a mercy in those small domesticities that cannot be faked. People sometimes ask me if I regret the way I did things. My answer is never simple. I regret the pain it caused my son. I regret the secrecy that widened the distance between us for months. But I do not regret the minutes I spent gathering facts, the nights I stayed awake, or the decision to ask for professional help. I cannot weigh the cost of one child's heartbreak against the cost of another's lifelong erosion. I only know the map I followed and the people who helped me reconstruct the pieces. If you remember one line from this long, messy story, let it be this: people carry both mercy and mistake in their pockets. We do harm when we think only of rightness without the tender calculus of love. We do help when we put facts before fury, and when we respect the lives of those who might be collateral in another's deception. I acted imperfectly out of a fierce, flawed love.
The outcomes were imperfect, too. In the end, truth taught, painfully, slowly, how to make repair. If this story touched you, or if you have a similar experience of betrayal, small triumph, or complicated family choices, please share it in the comments. There is comfort in knowing we're not alone in how we navigate the jagged edges of loving someone who makes mistakes. Thank you for being here to listen, and for the kindness you bring to stories that are, at their heart, human and fragile.